The contract was 4 pages long. It had been reviewed by a lawyer, not a real marriage lawyer. A commercial contracts lawyer who had asked no questions and charged a flat fee and handed back the signed document without looking either of them in the eye. Which was fine, because neither of them was looking at each other either. The terms were simple. 1 year. She would live in his house as his wife. She would attend family events. She would speak to his mother as a daughter-in-law speaks to a mother-in-law. She would maintain the appearance of a normal marriage to everyone outside this arrangement. In exchange, he would pay her monthly, a specific, agreed, reasonable amount. He would fund her younger brother's medical treatment. He would not require any physical intimacy beyond what was visible to others. He would not interfere with her personal life outside the house. At the end of 12 months, they would quietly separate. She would keep everything he had paid. He would keep his inheritance. Because the inheritance, the significant, multi-property, Lagos real estate inheritance from his late grandfather, had a condition attached to it. The condition said, married by 35. He was 34 in 10 months. She was 28. She was broke. Her brother was sick. The treatment was expensive. The terms made sense. They signed, both of them, with the same pen, in the commercial lawyer's office in Ikeja on a Thursday afternoon. And they shook hands. And they did not look at each other. And they went to his car. And they drove in silence to the house where they would live for the next 12 months. Neither of them knew what they were driving into. Neither of them had any idea. If you are already leaning forward at this arrangement, if something in you knows that a contract cannot hold what is about to happen between these two people, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because we go all the way with these stories. We do not stop before the real thing. Subscribe and drop in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Every country, every city, every person who has ever told themselves they could control something that turned out to be bigger than any contract. We want you here. Subscribe, drop your location, and let us go back to where this started. His name was Tobenna Okeke. Everyone called him Tobe. He was 34 years old. He was from an old Onitsha family. His grandfather, Chief Nnamdi Okeke, had been a man of significant property and significant opinions. The opinions were many. The most relevant one, the one that was now causing Tobe considerable inconvenience, was the opinion on marriage. Chief Nnamdi had believed that a man who reached middle age without a wife was a man who could not be trusted with responsibility. He had expressed this belief often, at family gatherings, at Christmas, in conversations with anyone who would listen. And then, because beliefs expressed often become principles, and because principles of a wealthy man become the conditions attached to the things he leaves behind, Chief Nnamdi had expressed this belief in his will. The will said, "To my grandson Tobenna, I leave the Lagos properties, being units at Victoria Island, Lekki Phase 1, and the commercial property in Surulere, conditional upon his being legally married at the time of my death, or within 18 months of my death, whichever is later." Chief Nnamdi had died 8 months ago. Tobe had been at the reading of the will. He had sat in a room with his uncle and his cousins and the family lawyer. He had heard the condition. He had looked at the ceiling. He had thought, of course there is a condition. Because his grandfather had believed in marriage. And because Tobe had not been married. Not because he had not tried. Not because he had never loved anyone. Because the last time he had tried, the last time he had decided to let someone close enough to build something with, it had ended in a way that had made building again feel like a thing he could do later. Always later. And later had become 10 years of later. And now the clock was running. 18 months. 10 already spent. 8 remaining. His mother had called. His mother, Ijeoma Okeke, was a precise woman who expressed herself in short, specific sentences and had opinions she did not keep to herself. She called after the will reading. She said, "Tobenna, 8 months." He said, "I know, Mama." She said, "Do you have someone?" He said, "I'm working on it." She said, "Working on it is not someone." He said, "I know." She said, "Your grandfather put that condition because he loved you." not to punish you. He said, I know. She said, he wanted you to have someone. He said, I know, Mama. She said, you say I know too much and do too little. He said, I hear you. She said, I will be in Lagos next month. I want to meet someone. He said, Mama. She said, next month. She hung up. He sat with his phone. He thought about the properties. He thought about his grandfather. He thought about 10 years of later. He thought about 8 months. He thought, I need a different solution. He went to his closest friend, Ijeoma Chukwudi, a man who had known him since secondary school, who had been at the will reading, who had watched Tobe's face when the condition was read. He sat with Ijeoma Chukwudi. He said, I need to find a wife. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, I know. He said, not a real one. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, what does that mean? He said, I mean, not for real. Not the whole thing. I need someone who will do it for a year, who will help me satisfy the condition. And then we part ways. Ijeoma Chukwudi stared at him. He said, you want to pay someone to be your wife? Tobe said, I want to make an arrangement. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, an arrangement. Tobe said, a professional arrangement. With a contract. With terms. Fair terms. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, Tobe, do you hear yourself? He said, I hear myself. And I know how it sounds. But think about it clearly. The alternative is losing properties worth hundreds of millions of naira because my grandfather had strong opinions about marriage. I don't have time to fall in love, Hugo. I have 8 months. Ijeoma Chukwudi was quiet. He said, who would agree to this? Tobe said, someone who needs something I can provide. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, that is the most transactional thing you have ever said. Tobe said, I know. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, and you're comfortable with it? Tobe said, I'm more comfortable with it than I am with losing the inheritance. Ijeoma Chukwudi looked at him. He said, if I help you find this person, you owe me. Tobe said, anything. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, I want to be at the reading of your actual real marriage vows someday. As a witness. Tobe said, don't start. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, I mean it. Tobe said, can you help me or not? He said, let me think. Her name was Ijeoma Chukwudi. Everyone called her Ije. She was 28. She was from Nui. She worked at a small media consultancy in Lagos. Copy editing. Good at her work. Not paid extravagantly for it. She lived in a 1-bedroom flat in Surulere with a roommate. She had a younger brother, Chidera, 24, who had been diagnosed with a kidney condition that required treatment that was beyond what the family could comfortably cover. Their father had died 6 years ago. Their mother sold fabric in Nui. The fabric business covered the basics. Not the treatment. Not the expensive, ongoing, specialist treatment that Chidera needed. Ije had been doing what she could. She had taken extra work. She had moved money around. She had asked for things she was not comfortable asking for. She had been managing. But managing was not the same as solving. And Chidera's next round of treatment had a deadline. She had been sitting with that deadline for 3 weeks when Ijeoma Chukwudi's call came. Ijeoma Chukwudi was the cousin of a woman in her office. He had heard, through the specific Lagos network of everybody knowing somebody, that she was in a difficult position. He had asked if he could speak to her. Not about what. Just, he had something he needed to discuss. She had agreed because she was not in a position to dismiss any conversation without knowing its content. He met her for coffee. He explained the situation. She listened. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said, tell me exactly what would be required. He told her. She said, and the terms? He told her. She said, I want to meet him first. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, of course. She met Tobe at a restaurant in Ikoyi. She had dressed carefully. Not to impress. To assess. She had thought about this the entire previous night. She had made a list. Questions she needed answers to before she could decide. She had been doing this with difficult decisions since she was a teenager. List the questions. Find the answers. Make the decision from the answers. Not from fear. Not from desperation. From information. He was already at the table when she arrived. She noticed him before he noticed her. He was looking at his phone. Tobe was not what she expected. She had expected someone who looked like a man who would make this kind of arrangement. Polished. Transactional. The kind of person who treats everything as a deal to be managed. He looked like neither of those things. He looked tired. Not in a failure way. In the way of someone who had been carrying something for a long time and was not yet at the point of putting it down. He looked up. He saw her. He stood. He said, Ijeoma. She said, Tobe. They sat. They looked at each other. He said, I imagine Ijeoma Chukwudi explained. She said, he explained the basics. I have questions. He said, ask. She took out her phone. She had her list in the Notes app. She held the phone. She said, why can't you find a real wife? He said, I don't have time. She said, that is the second reason. What is the first? He looked at her. He said, what makes you think there's a first? She said, because a man who does not have the capacity to love doesn't make this arrangement. He just lets the inheritance go. A man who makes this arrangement is a man who had the capacity and does not want to use it right now. He was quiet. He said, perceptive. She said, answer the question. He said, I tried before. It didn't work out. I haven't wanted to try again. She said, how long ago? He said, 10 years. She said, 10 years. He said, yes. She said, what happened? He said, that is a longer answer than this conversation requires. She said, maybe, but it tells me something about what I'm agreeing to. He said, what does it tell you? She said, whether this is a man who is protecting himself from something specific or just someone who doesn't want to do the work. He looked at her. He said, it's the first one. She said, okay. She looked at the next question. She said, what happens when your family asks real questions? About how we met. About our relationship. About the details that people know about couples. He said, we construct a story. We learn each other well enough to tell it. She said, what if they ask to visit? He said, the house is large enough that we can maintain appearances. She said, meaning separate rooms. He said, yes. I told Ijeoma Chukwudi. She said, I know what he told me. I'm confirming directly. He said, separate rooms. No physical requirements beyond what any couple would do publicly. Hand-holding at functions. Nothing that would make either of us uncomfortable. She said, and my brother's treatment. He said, fully covered. From day one. As a separate arrangement, distinct from the monthly payment. If the arrangement ends early, for any reason, the treatment funding continues until he is clear. She said, why would the arrangement end early? He said, I don't know. Life. Something I haven't anticipated. I want you to know the commitment is real regardless. She looked at him. He was looking at her steadily. Not nervously. Not performing confidence. Just. Steady. She said, one more question. He said, ask. She said, what kind of person are you to live with? He was quiet for a moment. He said, honest answer? She said, only answer. He said, quiet. Private. I work from home 2 days a week, so I will be around. I am not good at small talk. I am good at leaving people alone when they need to be left alone. I cook reasonably well. I have no bad habits that would bother another person. She said, everyone has at least one bad habit. He said, I stay up late reading. She said, that's not a bad habit. He said, I buy too many books and run out of shelf space. She said, also not a bad habit. He almost smiled. Just almost. She said, okay. He said, okay, you're considering it. Or okay, we have a deal? She said, okay, I'll talk to a lawyer. He said, of course. She talked to a lawyer. Not his commercial contracts person. Her own. A woman named Tobenna Okeke who specialized in exactly the kind of agreements that don't fit into normal categories. She reviewed everything. She said, this is unusual. I said, I know. She said, but it is a contract. And if the terms are honored, it is legally binding. She said, are the terms fair? Tobenna said, the money is fair. The treatment commitment is generous. The separation clause is clean. She said, what's the risk? Chidinma said, the risk is that you are living with this person for a year. That is not a contractual risk. That is a personal one. She said, I can manage a personal risk. Chidinma looked at her. She said, Ijeoma, I am not just your lawyer right now. I am a woman who is going to ask you something. She said, ask. She said, is this the only option? She thought about Chidera, about the treatment, about the deadline, about the fabric business, about the Lego salary, about the months of managing that had not become solving. She said, it is the fastest one. Chidinma said, that is not the same as the only one. She said, I know. Chidinma said, do you want to do this? She thought about it honestly. She said, I want my brother to be okay. If this does that, then yes. Chidinma said, and the rest of it? She said, the rest of it is 12 months. I have done harder things. Chidinma said, okay. She drafted the additional clauses. Protections for Ij. Specifics on the treatment funding. Exit terms. They sent it to Tobe's side. He accepted everything without negotiation. She noted that. She filed it. She went back to Chidinma. She said, he accepted everything. Chidinma said, I noticed. She said, what does that tell you? Chidinma said, that he either doesn't care about the terms because he's desperate, or that he thinks the terms are fair. Or she stopped. She said, or what? Chidinma said, or he is actually a decent person who is in an unusual situation. She said, which do you think? Chidinma said, I think you will find out. They sign on a Thursday. They moved her things in on a Saturday. The house in Onairu. A proper house. Not extravagant by the standards of what his grandfather had left, but substantial. A sitting room that was full of books. She noticed this immediately. Books the way serious readers have books. Not displayed. Used. Covers worn. Bookmarks inside. Notes in the margins she could see from a distance. She noticed. She said nothing. He showed her to her room. It was a proper room. Larger than her entire flat. A bathroom attached. A window with light. A wardrobe that was empty and waiting. He said, make it yours. Whatever you need, tell me. She said, I don't need much. He said, that's fine too. He left her to settle in. She stood in the room. She looked at it. She thought, 12 months. She thought, Chidera. She thought, this is fine. This is manageable. The first month was the careful month. Both of them careful. The way you are careful when you are sharing a space with someone you do not know. The careful of, I heard you and I am going to give you space before coming into this kitchen. The careful of, you seem busy and I am not going to intrude. The careful of, we are strangers who have agreed to pretend otherwise. He worked from his study most of the day. She worked from her laptop at the dining table or in her room. They cooked separately at first. Then one evening she was making soup, and there was more than she needed, and she knocked on the study door. She said, I made too much oaf aqua. Do you want some? He said, from inside. Give me 5 minutes. He came out. He ate. He said, this is very good. She said, thank you. They ate in the kitchen. Not at the table. At the kitchen counter. Because the table felt too formal for two people who had just decided to be less careful. He said, where did you learn to cook like this? She said, my mother. Nui. He said, Onicha family here. We are competitors. She looked at him. He said, I'm joking. She said, I know. But barely. He almost smiled again. That almost smile. She noticed it. She filed it. The first test came in the second month. His mother came. Tobenna Okeke arrived with a suitcase and opinions. She arrived on a Friday afternoon. Ij had been warned. 2 days before, Tobe had knocked on her door. He had said, my mother is coming on Friday. She had said, okay. He had said, she will ask questions. She had said, I know. He had said, a lot of questions. She had said, I assumed. He had said, she will also watch. She had said, I know how mothers watch. He had said, do we need to prepare anything? She had looked at him. She had said, "Tell me about us." He had said, "What?" She had said, "Tell me how we met. What we are to each other. What we like about each other. Tell me the story." He had sat down. They had built it together. Not dishonestly. A version of the truth that honored the truth's shape. They had met through a mutual connection. They had talked. They had found each other interesting. They had decided to build something. None of that was false. It was incomplete. But incomplete was not the same as false. They had sat at the kitchen counter and built the story for 2 hours. And in the building of it, something had happened. Something small. She had said, "What is it you actually like about what I do?" He had said, "Copy editing?" She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Honestly, I think it's underrated. The person who fixes the errors before the world sees them never gets the credit. But the work is worse without them." She had looked at him. He had said, "Also, you have very good instincts. You caught the error in the Ijeoma Chukwudi brief I left on the table last week." She had said, "The paragraph that contradicted the one before it?" He had said, "You read it." She had said, "I wasn't trying to. It was on the table." He had said, "What would you have done?" She had said, "I would have removed the second paragraph entirely. The first one was stronger." He had looked at her. He had said, "That was the right call." She had looked at him. That was the first real exchange. The first one that was not careful. The first one that was just two people talking. Ijeoma arrived on a Friday. She walked in. She looked at her son. She looked at Ije. She assessed Ije the way only a certain kind of Nigerian mother can assess a daughter-in-law. In approximately 7 seconds. Then she said, "You are Ijeoma." Ije said, "Yes, ma." "Welcome." Ijeoma said, "Nui." Ije said, "Yes, ma." Ijeoma said, "Good people come from Nui." Tobe said, "Mama." Ijeoma said, "I am saying something true." She sat down. She said, "Come and sit with me." Ije sat. Ijeoma looked at her son. She said, "Go and get my bag." He went. She looked at Ije. She said, "He told me about you." Ije said, "Good things, I hope." Ijeoma said, "He said you are direct." She said, "That is accurate." Ijeoma said, "He said you are not easily impressed." She said, "Also accurate." Ijeoma said, "He said you read." She said, "Yes." Ijeoma said, "Have you read his books?" She said, "Some of them." Ijeoma said, "Which ones?" She said the titles. 3 of them. Ijeoma looked at her. She said, "He loves those books." She said, "I know." Ijeoma said, "How do you know?" She said, "The margins. He wrote in the margins. You can tell which books a person loves by the margins." Ijeoma was quiet. She looked at Ije for a long moment. She said, "Good. Just that. Good." Tobe came back with the bag. He looked at them. He looked at his mother's face. Something on it he could not read. He looked at Ije. She looked at him. She said, "Your mother and I were just talking." He said, "About?" Ijeoma said, "Books." He sat down slowly. He said, "About books." Both women said nothing. Ijeoma stayed 4 days. 4 days of watching. Of questions. Of the particular kind of examination that a mother does when she is trying to understand whether the woman beside her son is real. Ije handled it. Not by performing. By being herself. Which was what she was best at. She was direct with Ijeoma. She disagreed with her twice on small things. She held her ground both times. She also deferred, twice, on things that were genuinely Ijeoma's domain. And on the 3rd day, while Tobe was in a work call, Ijeoma and Ije cooked together. Without planning it. Ije was in the kitchen. Ijeoma appeared. She looked at what Ije was making. She said, "You are overcooking the onions." Ije said, "I like them soft." Ijeoma said, "Soft and burnt are different things." Ije turned down the heat. She said, "Better?" Ijeoma said, "Better." She picked up an onion and began to peel. They cooked in the kitchen. Together. In the silence that is not empty. The silence of 2 women who are figuring out the shape of each other. Ijeoma said, "Eventually, he hasn't been happy." Ije said, "For how long?" Ijeoma said, 10 years. She said, since what happened? Adana looked at her. She said, he told you. She said, briefly, not the details. Adana said, the details are his to tell. But I will say this, the last 10 years, my son has been building. He has been very productive, very focused, very good at many things. She paused. She said, but he has been building with a wall around him. And the things outside the wall, the things that require you to let someone close enough to be hurt, those things he has been avoiding. She said, I see it. Adana said, can you handle that? She looked at this woman. This precise woman who expressed things in specific sentences. She said, I can handle most things. Adana said, that is not what I asked. She said, I know. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I don't know yet. I have been here 6 weeks. Adana looked at her. She said, honest. She said, you asked for honest. Adana said, I did. She said, but I will tell you this. Whatever is behind the wall, I am not afraid of it. I have been around complicated things. I'm not easily spooked. Adana held her eyes for a long moment. She said, good. She went back to the onions. On the 4th day, before she left, she held her son at the door. She said, quietly but not quietly enough, she is good. He said, Mama. She said, she is the first person in 10 years who has been honest with me about you. The others were all performing. He said, Mama. She said, don't mess this up. She got in the car. She left. He stood at the door. He came inside. He found Ije in the kitchen. He said, what did you say to her? She said, we talked. About cooking and books and things. He said, she said you were honest about me. She said, I didn't say anything private. I just didn't pretend. He said, you didn't pretend to know things you didn't know. She said, pretending takes effort. I try not to waste effort. He looked at her. He said, thank you. She said, for what? He said, for handling her. She said, she's not difficult. She's just watching. He said, most people find her difficult. She said, most people are afraid of being seen. He said, and you're not? She said, I've been seen before. It has never been as bad as the fear of it. He looked at her. That look, the one she had not seen yet. The one that was not polite, not professional. The one that was actually looking at her. Seeing. She looked back. For a moment. Then she said, I made extra soup. It's on the stove. She went to her room. He stood in the kitchen. For a long time. Month 4. Something had changed in the texture of the house. Not dramatically. In the way that temperature changes. You do not notice the exact moment the room gets warmer. You just notice one day that you are no longer cold. They talked. Not just the covering of silence. Real talking. She had mentioned a story she was editing at work. He had asked about it. She had told him. He had said something that was exactly the right kind of wrong. She had argued with him. He had argued back. They had talked for an hour and a half, and neither of them had noticed. Ijeoma Chukwudi came for dinner one evening. He sat across from both of them and watched them talk. Afterward, when Ije had gone to bed, he said to Tobe, you are going to tell me this is just arrangement. Tobe said, it is an arrangement. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, you looked at her 17 times during dinner. Tobe said, I was being attentive. We have guests. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, you looked at her when she wasn't speaking. Tobe said, Ijeoma Chukwudi said, when was the last time you looked at someone when they weren't speaking? Tobe said, don't. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, she's remarkable, Tobe. She is genuinely remarkable. And she is in your house. And she is your wife. Tobe said, for 8 more months. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, that is not how you said it. He said, what? Ijeoma Chukwudi said, you said 8 more months like someone who is counting down to a thing they are not looking forward to. Tobe said, I have work early. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, I will be here in 8 months when you come back and tell me I was right. He said, good night, Ijeoma Chukwudi. He went to his room. He lay in the dark. He thought about 17 times. He had not been counting. But he did not think Ijeoma Chukwudi was wrong. Month 5. She had a difficult week. Chitara's treatment required a complication they had not anticipated. A new specialist. New costs. Tobe had already covered it before she could ask. She found out when Chitara called to say the appointment was booked. She went to Tobe's study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She came in. She said, "Chitara's appointment." He said, "Dr. Adeyemi, best kidney specialist in Lagos. The clinic called yesterday." She said, "You didn't tell me." He said, "I didn't want to make it a thing. It needed to happen. So it happened." She said, "Tobe." He said, "Is he okay? Did the appointment go well?" She said, "It went well. The new treatment plan is better." He said, "Good." She stood at the door. She said, "I don't know how to." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "Tobe." He looked up from his desk. She said, "You didn't have to do it the way you did. You could have told me and let me handle it. You did it quietly. So I wouldn't." She stopped. He said, "So you wouldn't worry?" She said, "So I wouldn't feel like I was asking." He said, "You never ask for enough." She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means you are very good at not needing things from people, which is efficient. But it also means that when you actually need something, you don't ask. You manage it alone. And sometimes things that need more than managing alone get managed badly." She stared at him. He said, "I'm not criticizing you. I recognize it because I do the same thing." She said, "You do?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Is that what the 10 years was? Managing alone?" He went still. She said, "You don't have to answer." He said, "Yes. That is what the 10 years was." She said, "What happened?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Come and sit down." She came. She sat. He told her. Her name was Kizaram. She had been with him for 3 years. He had planned to marry her. He had been planning it. He had not proposed yet because he was the kind of person who wanted everything to be right, who wanted the moment to be earned, who was building toward it carefully. And while he was building carefully, she had decided he was not coming. Not because he had said so, because he had not said the other thing. She had met someone who said the other thing, who moved faster, who did not plan carefully, who said, "I want you, now," without waiting to earn the moment. She had chosen the one who said it clearly, not because she did not love Tobe. She had. She had told him this, which was its own kind of cruelty. She had said, "I love you, but you never told me. You never gave me the certain thing to hold, and I needed to be held certainly." He had sat with that for 10 years, not with anger. With the particular stillness of someone who had made an error, he could not go back and correct. He had been too careful. He had been so careful that she had not known what she was to him, and the not knowing had allowed the other thing in. He told Ije this. All of it. In the study. With the books behind him. She listened. The way she listened when something mattered. With all of herself. When he finished, she said, "You were not wrong for planning." He said, "I was wrong for not saying." She said, "Yes." He said, "You agree." She said, "The planning was love." But she couldn't see inside the planning. She could only see the silence. He said, "Yes." She said, "And you learned from it by deciding not to let anyone close enough to need the saying." He said, "Yes." She said, "Which solved the problem of being hurt, and also solved the problem of being happy." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not judging. I'm describing." He said, "I know." She said, "For what it's worth." She stopped. He said, "Say it." She said, "The silence from you. The absence of the saying." I never read it as absence. I read it as someone who was still processing before speaking, who needed more before giving. He said, "How did you read it that way?" She said, "Because the things you do say are worth waiting for. And because the things you do without speaking," she gestured. "Chitara's appointment. The way you handle the Dana. The way you leave soup for me when you cook on the nights I work late." He said, "You noticed that?" She said, "I notice things." He said, "I know." They sat in the study. With the books. With the Lagos night outside. with the weight of 10 years on one side and 5 months on the other. And in the middle, something that had been growing without either of them deciding to grow it. She stood. She said, "You should sleep. You have an early call." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you for telling me." He said, "Thank you for asking." She went to her room. He sat in the study for a long time. Month 6. The midpoint. She was washing dishes one evening. He came into the kitchen. He said, "I need to tell you something." She turned. She looked at him. He said, "The inheritance. The properties." She said, "What about them?" He said, "I got a letter from the estate lawyer today. The condition has been satisfied. The legal marriage is on record. The properties transfer next month." She said, "Good." He said, "We don't have to continue if you don't want to." She dried her hands on the dish towel. She said, "The contract says 12 months. He said, "The contract says we can terminate early with mutual consent." She said, "Is that what you want?" He said, "I'm asking what you want." She looked at him. She thought about the study, about the soup left for her when she worked late, about 17 times during dinner, about the books with the margins, about Adana saying, "Don't mess this up," about 6 months of something growing without either of them deciding. She said, "What I want is complicated." He said, "Tell me." She said, "Tobe, if I tell you what I want, you need to understand what you're asking." He said, "What am I asking?" She said, "You're asking me to be honest. And if I'm honest, we are no longer in the contract. We are in something else. And something else requires more from both of us than the contract did." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The wall, Tobe. The 10 years of the wall. That is what something else requires you to take down." He said, "I know." She said, "Not just for me. For you. Because you deserve to be on the other side of it." He said, "I know." She said, "Then you should say it." He said, "Say what?" She said, "The thing you have been not saying." He looked at her. She looked back. The kitchen. The dish towel in her hand. The soup on the stove. The house that had become something neither of them had planned. He said, "Ijeoma." She said, "Yes." He said, "I don't want this to end in 6 months." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I have been inside this house for 6 months, and I have not been managing alone. And I have not been performing. And I have not been afraid." He said, "You are the first person since Kizaram who I have wanted to say things to. And this time I am not going to wait until the silence becomes the wrong thing." She said, "You are saying it." He said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay, you heard me." Or okay, something more. She said, "Okay, I am going to put this dish towel down." She put it down. She walked to him. She stood close. She said, "I did not come into this house expecting anything. I came for Chitara. I came for the solution." She said, "But 6 months is enough time to see who someone is. And who you are," she paused. "Who you are is worth something real. Not a contract." He said, "Ijeoma." She said, "I know what the contract was for. And I know what this is not the contract anymore." He said, "No." She said, "Then what is it?" He said, "I don't know yet. But I know I don't want to figure it out in 6 months. I want to figure it out with more time." She said, "More time." He said, "With you. Properly. Without the arrangement. With actual choosing." She said, "That is the saying." He said, "That is the saying." She looked at him. For a long moment. Then she said, "Okay." This time it was a different okay. The kind that opens something. They told Ijeoma Chukwudi together. He sat across from them. He looked at Tobe. He looked at Ije. He said, "You are telling me." Tobe said, "We are ending the contract." Ijeoma Chukwudi said, "And starting something real." Ije said, "We are seeing where it goes." Ijeoma Chukwudi said, "Where it goes." He said, "Yes." Without the deadline. Without the terms. Ijeoma Chukwudi said, "Tobenna Okeke." He said, "Don't." Ijeoma Chukwudi said, "I said I wanted to be at the reading of your real vows." He said, "We are not at vows." Ijeoma Chukwudi said, "Yet." He said, Yuga Chukwu. Ije said, he has a point. Tobe looked at her. She looked back. That look between them. That was not a contract look. Yuga Chukwu said, I will be here. He poured himself more water. He said, both of you are impossible. Also the most functional thing I have seen in years. He said, please stop pretending you didn't know this was going to happen. Ije said, I had a contract. Yuga Chukwu said, you had a contract in an office. Then you came home, and you read each other's margins. She looked at him. He said, Tobe told me. About the books. About what you said about people and margins. She said, I should have been more careful. Yuga Chukwu said, the careful ones are always the last to see it. They had the harder conversation. The one about what the real thing required. The one that was not covered in the 4-page contract. She said, I need you to understand something. He said, tell me. She said, I came into this arrangement from a position of need. My brother was sick. I needed the money. Those things are still true. And the fact that this is becoming something real does not retroactively make the beginning equal. He said, I know. She said, I don't want you to later look at this and tell yourself that I chose you because of the situation. I want you to know, now clearly, that what I feel is not because of what you did for Chitara. The two things are separate. He said, how do I know they're separate? She said, because I told you about Chitara in week 2 and I told you what I feel in week 24. The gap between those two things is 22 weeks of choosing to be present and honest and to learn who you are. That gap is the answer. He was quiet. He said, and I need you to understand something. She said, tell me. He said, I paid you to come here. And that is not something I am proud of. It was the best solution I could find at the time. But it was a transaction. And you deserve more than having started as a transaction. She said, I don't hold it against you. He said, I hold it against myself. She said, don't. We were both solving a problem. And in solving it, we found something we weren't looking for. That is not a diminishment of the finding. He said, you're sure? She said, I am rarely uncertain about what I mean. He said, I know. She said, then trust that. He said, I'm learning to. They told Adana. Not everything. The shape of it. Adana came back to Lagos 3 months after her first visit. This time she came because Ije had called and said, come for a proper stay. Not an assessment. Just time. Adana had come. She had spent a week. And on the last evening, she had sat with both of them. And Tobe had said, Mama, this is not ending in the way it was supposed to end. Adana had said, I know. He had said, you know? She had said, I knew on my first visit. The books. The margins. The way she talked about you without trying to impress me. Ije had said, you knew that early? Adana had said, I have been watching my son for 34 years. I know what he looks like when he is alive. She had looked at him. She said, this is what it looks like. He had not said anything. Neither had Ije. But the silence between them had said everything. Adana had said, I don't know how this started. I don't need to know. I know what it is now. She had taken her son's hand. She had taken Ije's hand. She had held them both. She had said, this is what I prayed for. Chitara came to Lagos when he was well enough. He came to meet the woman who had made him well. Not in those terms. Just to meet his sisters. His person. He was a thin young man with their father's eyes and a particular kind of gratitude in his face. The gratitude of someone who has been close enough to the edge to understand how precious the middle is. He sat in the sitting room. He looked at Tobe. He said, you helped my sister. Tobe said, your sister helped me. He said, with what? Tobe looked at Ije. She looked back. He said, with a wall I had been building for a long time. Chitara looked at him. He looked at his sister. He said, you tore down a wall. She said, I didn't tear it down. I just didn't pretend it wasn't there. Chitara said, that is the same thing. She said, I know. He said to Tobe, take care of her. Tobe said, I am learning to let her take care of herself. Which is what she actually needs. Chitara looked at him. He said, you know her. Tobe said, I am starting to. Chitara said, good. He said it the way their father would have said it. She saw it on his face. The echo of their father. She looked away. Tobe saw her look away. He put his hand on hers. She looked at him. He did not say anything. He just left the hand there. She left her hand under his. The 12 months ended. Not with a separation. Not with the clean, contractual quiet exit they had planned on a Thursday afternoon in a lawyer's office in Ikeja. The 12 months ended with a conversation at the kitchen counter, where they had eaten together for the first time. Sitting on the same stools. She said, the year is up. He said, I know. She said, the contract is technically complete. He said, yes. She said, are we going to discuss what that means? He said, I thought we already did. She said, we discussed wanting to continue. We didn't discuss the actual next thing. He said, what is the actual next thing? She said, I'm not moving out. He said, good. I wasn't going to let you. She said, you can't stop me. He said, I was going to follow you. She looked at him. He said, if you had left, I was going to go wherever you went and knock on the door and say, I know we had a contract and the contract is done, but I am not done. And asked to start over. She said, start over. He said, as ourselves. No contract. No inheritance pressure. Just, I am Tobenna. You are Ijeoma. And I want to know what we are. She said, we already know what we are. He said, then I want to say it properly. She said, say it. He said, I love you. Just that. Said the way things should have been said 10 years ago. Clearly. Without waiting for the perfect moment. Without the careful building. Just, clearly. She looked at him. She said, Tobenna. He said, yes. She said, I love you too. She said, I have been loving you since about month 3. I did not say it because the contract made saying it complicated. He said, when did the contract stop being the contract? She thought about it. She said, when you handled Chitara without telling me. Because you didn't want me to feel like I was asking. He said, that early. She said, yes. He said, why didn't you say anything? She said, because I was not sure if you were being kind or if you were feeling what I was feeling. And the contract made the difference important. He said, and now? She said, and now the contract is over. And the difference is clear. He said, yes. She said, so. He said, so. They were quiet. At the kitchen counter. In the house that was no longer an arrangement. That had become the most honest place either of them had been in a long time. He said, Ijeoma. She said, yes. He said, will you stay? She said, I wasn't planning on leaving. He said, I mean, will you stay properly? As a real choice. Not because of the contract. Not because of what came before. But because you choose to. She said, Tobenna. He said, yes. She said, I'm still here. She said it the way Obi had said it in the other story. The way Mama Chitty had said it in the other story. The way all the people who mean it say it. I'm still here. He understood what it meant. He held her hand. She held his. Ijeoma Chukwudi was at the wedding. 14 months after the contract. He was at the front. As a witness. As he had said. He watched them exchange vows. He watched Tobe say the words. Clearly. Without waiting for the perfect moment. Without the wall. Just, clearly. And he watched Ije receive them. With the full attention she brought to everything. Not performing. Not overwhelmed. Just. Present. After the ceremony, he found her. He said, he told me about the contract. She said, I figured. He said, he also told me something else. She said, what? He said, he told me that the best decision of his life was made from the worst place. From desperation. From an inheritance problem. From a Thursday afternoon in a lawyer's office. She said, the best decisions are sometimes the ones made under pressure. He said you told him that. She said, approximately. Ijeoma Chukwudi looked at her. He said, you are remarkable. She said, people keep saying that. He said, because it is true. She said, thank you for bringing us together. He said, I brought 2 people to a restaurant. You did everything else. She said, we did. He said, yes, you did. This is what the story teaches. That the beginning of a thing does not determine its nature. That a transaction begun from need can become a relationship born from truth. That a contract signed with a pen and witnessed by a commercial lawyer who asked no questions can become the entry point to the most important room either person has ever stood in. But only if both people are willing to see what is actually there. Not what they planned. Not what the arrangement described. What is actually there. The tired man who loves books and leaves soup on the stove. The direct woman who reads margins and does not pretend to know what she doesn't. The mother who watches and sees. The brother who lives. The friend who says, I told you so. But gently. With love. The wall that came down. Not because it was forced. Because the person on the other side of it was not afraid of what was behind it. And was patient enough to wait for it to come down on its own. That is the story. Not the contract. The patience. Not the arrangement. The choosing. Not the transaction. The love. You just sat with 2 people who signed a 4-page contract to survive. You sat with them through the careful first months. Through the dinner where he looked at her 17 times. Through the study conversation where he finally said the 10-year thing out loud. Through the kitchen counter where the contract ended and something real began. And if you felt it, if something about the transition from arrangement to love, from transaction to truth, from desperation to choice, if something in that movement touched you, then you know exactly why this channel exists. Because we believe in those stories. The ones that start in the wrong place and find their way to the right one. The ones where 2 people come together for practical reasons and stay for impossible ones. The ones where the wall comes down slowly. And the person waiting on the other side is still there. Still there. We believe in those stories the way our grandmothers believed in them. Not as fairy tales. As truths. As the real thing that happens to real people when they are honest enough to stop performing and start seeing. Subscribe to this channel right now. Not for the algorithm. For the next story. For the next man with a wall. For the next woman with a list of questions and a brother who needs help. For every arrangement that became something real. For every transaction that became something sacred. This channel holds those stories. We need you here to hold them with us. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button if Ije and Tobe made you feel something that you are still sitting with. Drop in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And tell us this. What is something in your life that started as one thing and became something completely different? Something you walked into for one reason and stayed for another? Tell us. Right there. In the comments. Because the people who watch these stories are people who understand transformation. Who understand that the best chapters sometimes begin in the worst offices. On the worst Thursdays. With the most transactional pens. And become the most honest rooms you have ever stood in. Subscribe. Come back. We will be here. With the next story. With the next house. With the next soup left on the stove. For the woman who reads margins. For the man who finally said it clearly. For both of them. 14 months after a 4-page contract. Still there.